For those of you I don't know, I'm Jessica Hubbard. I'm the Executive Director of the Yolo Community Foundation. YCF works to inspire and support giving and provide philanthropic leadership in Yolo County. And so to be really clear on our role in this process, this is a county program, Yolo County, it's Yolo County money, Yolo County process, Yolo County program, Yolo County decision-making. YCF is involved for two specific reasons. One is to conduct outreach to the Yolo nonprofit sector to make sure that, you know, all of our varied and diverse nonprofits hear about the opportunity. And two is to do provide support to applicants. So help the applicants understand the process, provide a little bit of grant writing, not training is a big word, but grant writing support, answer questions, do a little hand holding, make sure nonprofits of all different sizes and backgrounds feel comfortable and able to apply for this grant. We are not involved in the grant review process. We are totally on the front end in terms of doing outreach and training for the nonprofit applicants or the applicants in general. We'll get to that. Today, we're gonna cover the sort of a grant basics overview. We're gonna talk quite a bit about eligibility. We're gonna talk about the grant making process, as well as a bit about what makes an effective grant in this particular context. So first of all, that covers, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. In terms of the basics, a lot of this should be familiar to you, I'm sure, as you learned a little bit about this program, but I want to cover some of the nuances. So first of all, as you probably know, there's $250,000 total allocated for this program, and that's $50,000 in each of the 5 supervisorial districts. So if you go to the application, I dropped that link in the chat, I'll do it again at the end of this. You will see this map, and there's a link on the application. If you're not sure which district you're in, you can click the link, put in your address, and it'll tell you exactly where the lines are. But the important things for you to know, and they look very different sizes on the map, but they are matched for population, so that there's equity across the community in terms of access to funding. Really important things for you to know about this 50,000 per district is that you should apply in the district where the program is taking place. So it doesn't matter where you're headquartered. It doesn't matter in general where you operate. What matters is for the program for which you are applying for funding, which district will it take place in? Where are the beneficiaries? And apply to that district. The other important thing to know is that you can apply for more than one district. So if you are running, it could be multiple programs in different districts, or it could be a single program across multiple districts. You can apply in any district where you are operating the program in question. The caveat to that is that if you are applying in multiple districts, your grant will be considered separately by each of those separate supervisors and their staffs. So you want to make sure that they're independent of one another. That if you're funded in District A and you're not funded in District B, you can still run in District A. And you're not going to go back to them and say, thanks so much for the funding, but because we didn't get funding for your colleagues, we can no longer operate the program. So go ahead and apply in multiple districts if you're doing programming in multiple districts, but please make sure your applications are independent of one another. Second key point is grant size. So as you know, the target grant size is 1,000 to 10,000. That word target is important. Technically, there's no minimum or maximum grant size. So, I mean, I guess $50,000 is the natural cap, right? Because that's what each supervisor has to allocate. But your application will be reviewed if you apply at below or above the target grant range. That said, the goal of this program is to make grants in the $1,000 to $10,000 range. So you have that option. It's not necessarily what we're recommending, but we did want to clarify that is a target grant range, not a firm requirement. Applications are due March 31st at 5 p.m. And then from an eligibility perspective, there's 2 ways we want to talk about eligibility. We'll talk about program eligibility next, but from applicant eligibility, this program is wide open. Anyone can apply. Nonprofits, for-profits, government agencies, individuals. There's no sort of anywhere in Yolo County, any kind of organization. The door is wide open here. The program has to be eligible, and we'll talk about that next, but the door to applicants is wide open. I also want to point out that applicants that have previously submitted an ARP proposal in the process are eligible. even if you've been funded by a different part of the process, you are eligible. But the supervisors don't want to add, they don't, if you got $200,000 through an existing grant, they don't want to just kick an additional $10,000 to the existing grant. If there's a new need, a new program, a new community need that you've identified and you want to apply for funding for that, that's fine. But please don't apply to just top off existing funding for an existing project that's already been funded. I'll stop there momentarily. Are there any questions about the grant basics? Feel free to pop them in the chat or just chime in.
So really quickly, I think that I missed or I quite didn't understand what you were saying about if you're applying in multiple districts, you should apply individually?
So you apply, yeah. So like if you're applying in multiple districts, you're submitting multiple applications. And the issue is just that like if you're a fund, they'll be considered independently. So if you are, and one district may choose to fund you while another district might not. And so you just want to make sure you can still run. Like if you apply for two $10,000 grants, that you're able to actually run in District A with $10,000 and you're not dependent on getting funded in multiple districts in order to run the program.
I see. Okay. Right. Yeah, that was the part I didn't understand. Okay, great.
Okay. Any other questions so far? Okay. So let's talk about project eligibility. So as we established, anyone can apply, door is wide open. However, the proposal, there are clear eligibility requirements. There's two ways to think about eligibility. One is the federal government's eligibility requirements, and two is the Board of Supervisors. So let's start with the federal government requirements. What you're seeing on your screen is and I linked to it when I dropped those links in the chat. If you came in late, I'm not sure if you can see those, but I'll add them again at the end. These are Yolo County's interpretation of the federal government requirements. So this is basically when it comes down to it. This is COVID-related money, right? This is pandemic-related money. And so I expect that most of you on the call are with nonprofits. Of course, this might not be the case, but I would anticipate that most nonprofit proposals will fall into the first two categories. So addressing the public health impacts, which includes mental health, and then addressing the negative economic impacts of the pandemic. Knowing what many of our nonprofits have been up to for the past 2 years, I would guess that most proposals will fall into one of those two categories. But certainly if you're working on water or broadband or with essential workers and so on, you're completely eligible to apply in those other buckets as well. This does mean that mitigating the impact of the pandemic on a nonprofit's own financials is like technically and eligible under the federal government guidelines. That said, the Board of Supervisors is really looking to see proposals that deliver services in the community. So don't think about this like the PPP loan, which is sort of making the organization whole. Think about it as a way to fund the organization's work with the community within these areas. The second set of eligibility principles is the board's guiding principles. These were developed by the Board of Supervisors here in Yolo County. There's also a link in the chat. Again, I'll post it again in a moment, that goes through these guiding principles in much more detail. I strongly recommend you spend some time looking through that. The really important thing to note about the board guiding principles is that the mini grants are one little corner of a $40 million process. So these principles were put into place with grants that have a lot more zeros on them in mind. They absolutely still stand for the mini grants, but of course the Board of Supervisors will be thinking about these principles in the context of the grants the grant sizes that you're requesting. So principles are, one-time funding. So on the one hand, that means that there's no expectation that additional funding will come in. So one way to think, sometimes that's just you have a specific need that is a one-off need. That's great. But it could also be like a pilot or a proof of concept grant where you'll need more funding in the future, but you'll be in a much better position to secure that funding from other donors once you've completed the project once. It could be saying that our circumstances are really unique right now at this point in the pandemic. We're confident that in a year when hopefully things will be better, we'll be in a position to fundraise in other ways, but this is what we need to get through this time period. Those also count as one-time funding. Next is the pandemic. That's critically important. As we talked about on the previous slide, this is pandemic related funding. And so you need to be able to demonstrate, you know, why your project is pandemic related. That could include pre-existing gaps that were exacerbated by the pandemic. It could include direct response to the pandemic, recovery. Do look at the full guiding principles on the Yolo County website. It's quite detailed here. But as you're filling out your application, this is a piece to hammer home. Thirdly is needs-based and data-informed. So again, this should address a real need in the community. That sounds pretty basic, but of course it's an important part of the application process. Data-informed is one of those pieces that how many zeros is on your proposal influences the expectations for how robust this will be. So for other parts of the process where they were making $2 million grants, they had high expectations about the data to back up your proposal. With these $10,000 grants, they know you could easily spend $10,000 collecting data, and there's no expectation that you would do that. So use the data available to you, quantitative or qualitative. It's great to include it, but you know, the expectations will be moderated because these are small grants. These last couple are mostly a little bit more about the board's process as opposed to the applications, except for this important piece around prioritizing transformational projects. That again, transformational is a real big word for a grant that might be $6,000. But I think the part to really think about here is driving home that impact, why your grant is important, why it's important now, why it's important to the end beneficiary, and how they're better off, maybe even in a transformational way because of your program. And then finally, links to the strategic plan, sort of in line with what Yolo County is trying to accomplish overall. I'll pause again. Yes, I can repost the link. Give me 1 second.
I do have a question about those links. They'll be up for a while.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here they are again. Okay, any questions about eligibility? Eric Will, who works for the county, is a brave man because he volunteered to be contacted by applicants if they have questions about eligibility. His email address is eric.will, I'm putting in the chat right now, at yolocounty.org. And it's quite likely that if you send him a question about this that's sort of broad, he'll say, it sounds eligible and we'll need to see your full application to know for sure. So, you know, if you're just kind of looking for reassurance, it isn't necessarily the best use of his time or your time. But if you have a sort of specific question, absolutely feel free to reach out to Eric and he can weigh in on that eligibility question. So grant making process, as you know, applications must be submitted by 5 p.m. on March 31st. The county staff will then review proposals for eligibility. So they'll mark them likely eligible, maybe eligible, or likely not eligible. And then they'll send them all on to the district staff. So the district staff will receive all of those proposals. Then the supervisors and district staff will review the proposals and select their proposed slate of grantees. The county staff will then loop back with the grantees, the prospective grantees, to confirm the program details, clear up any eligibility questions, make sure everything is sort of still good to go. And then finally, the full slate of proposed grantees will go to the Board of Supervisors for final approval. Any questions about the process?
I have a question. Do you know when they expect to go in front of the board?
I don't. I think it's probably, I mean, if they're going, I wouldn't, broadly, I would say May or June. But I wouldn't want to, that's a guess, not anything that's calendared.
I have a question. I was talking to somebody today and they said that they were not going to try for this because they couldn't show that they had been, their finances had been negatively impacted.
It doesn't matter at all. It's about the program. So if their program, I'll go back a couple slides. If their program, you know, if they were doing, for instance, a program for Yolo County residents who had a negative economic impact, and it is one time, and the economic impact was because of the pandemic and so on, then that's eligible. It doesn't matter. So someone asked in the other session, is the grant size have anything to do with the organization's finance size? And again, it doesn't matter. It's programmatic funding. There are pros and cons of programmatic versus organizational funding. But in this case, like from that perspective, it's a pro. If they can do a good program that meets the needs, outlined in the board principles and the eligibility requirement, they're eligible. Okay, so looking at an effective application in this context, if for those of you who have looked at the application, it is real simple. It is basically 5-ish questions, and they're 3 to 5. It's with a, it's not a firm character limit or anything. It just says 3 to 5 sentences per answer. So it's not one where you're going to be asked to pull together your 990 and your balance sheet and your this, that, and the other and get signatures from your board secretary and so on. It's simple. What is going to be key is for in, relatively small amount of space to be able to highlight and communicate several key themes. So first of all, is need. So as you saw in those guidelines, they were looking for proposals that address a critical need in the community, as you would expect. So it's important that you're able to communicate in your proposal what is the need that you're going to address and why does it matter in that supervisorial district. In some cases, that's real obvious, right? And it's 3 to 5 sentences. You don't need to use 14 citations to make your case. But you do need to really be able to say, there's a need, this matters, and this is a need in this district and that we're going to go after. The second is how the problem relates to the pandemic. So that's that nexus to the pandemic and the board guiding principles. Maybe the problem already existed, that's totally fine, but the problem was exacerbated by the pandemic, or more people experienced it, or it's more problematic, or maybe it's new because of the pandemic. So making that clear is very important. Thirdly, the impact on the beneficiaries. So because you did this program, the beneficiaries will be better off in XYZ ways. Fourth is the number of beneficiaries served. Again, these are small grants. It doesn't have to be 80,000, whatever the number is, that's great, but just be clear on what that number is. If it's an estimate, that's fine. However you want to scope that is fine, just include it. And then finally, in brief, sort of who your organization is and why, to provide context for your ability to carry out the proposal. In many cases, you may be well known to your supervisors, but because this is so wide open, because 3 friends with a great idea could apply, you do want to make sure that you're demonstrating that you are well positioned as an applicant to carry out the program that you're proposing. There's not a specific question that asks that. So you could either integrate it into your answers if it fits naturally, or there's a question at the end that just says sort of what else do you want us to know? And so dropping a sentence or two about that would be a good use of that space if you don't integrate it elsewhere. And then more broadly, some sort of general tips. One is it is a short application. It doesn't require extensive detail. But you do just remember that the reviewers will be reviewing application after application after application. If you've ever done that or something like it, the clearer and simpler the language is, the more your 4th grader can understand it, the more your reviewers can understand it as well. So I focus on really being clear and sharing your key highlights. You don't have room to go into great detail, which is a great time saving. It does mean you have to be able to highlight what is the most important things you want the reviewer to take away from this. Making it readable, avoiding jargon. I'd recommend thinking about having someone who isn't involved in your program read it and see if they understand what it is that your program does. So that's something that can really help you with making sure it's simple enough that, because you're so close to it, right? And you're intimately involved in the program. And so making sure that someone who doesn't have that context can understand it is a good test for the review process. In general, I find that grant applicants are really excellent at communicating what the need is, and they're really excellent at communicating what the desired end state is, but they often struggle to, they often struggle to, sorry, give me a second, my Zoom is blocking. Okay, whatever. I'm going to stop sharing because we're just fun. I'm going to circulate this presentation later. So really excellent at communicating the need, really excellent at communicating the desired end state. But oftentimes, again, because you're so close to the program, it's hard for you as an applicant to clearly communicate, what are you actually going to do? And why is it that that thing that you're doing leads you from the need to the desired end state? So I would focus there, really clarify what it is you're going to do with this program. As we talked about, everyone's eligible, but not every program is eligible. So if you've got questions, really review those guidelines, the guiding principles and the eligibility requirements, and reach out to Eric if necessary. Give yourself time to draft and edit. This is a really easy application. So it's tempting to kind of like do it at the end because you've still got, a month almost until it's due. But this is the kind of application that will really benefit from some time to marinate. So I'd recommend, you can't go in and save it. So just check out the application, do it in Word, give yourself time to sort of reflect and edit down. As I said, maybe get someone else to take a look at it and just let it marinate a little bit. So you can really are sure that in those 3 to 5 sentences per answer, you're communicating what matters most. Pull from existing content where relevant. There's no need to reinvent the wheel here. If you've got a relevant grant application you can cut and paste from your website, whatever, feel free. Do not feel like you need to be doing this from scratch if you've got copy that will work here. And then finally, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to come to our office hours. So I'll drop that link again. We're having office hours 3 times over the next few weeks, where we will there's no agenda. I'll just be here for an hour or 2 on Zoom. You can pop in when it's convenient for you. I'll stay on the whole time, even if there's no one there, so that you can ask whatever questions you've got that might come up in the process. So I know that was a lot of information. I'm going to stop and check out the questions in the chat and feel free to pipe in with others. Martha asked, is there a time frame for program implementation? There's not a stated time frame. You'll see in the application that it says basically like, I forget the exact categories, but in the next few months, later this year, and a year or more in the future. If this is for a proposal that's like really a year or 2 down the road, it might not be the best fit for this program. But there's not a specific timeline like you would often see in a grant proposal like this.
Just a quick second on that. What if it's an earlier program, like a summer program? Do you think they'll get enough time?
It's just a matter of whether, I don't think there's an eligibility concern there. It's just a matter of whether the money will come in time.
Yeah.
So, like I said, I don't want to speculate too much on the time frame. I know that in the board meeting, there was some, when they approved this, there was some hope of getting it out this fiscal year, which I believe the county fiscal year ends June 30th, but that was more of a discussion as opposed to a policy decision.
Okay.
So I think they're hoping that by early summer or so it'll be done, but it's not, that may or may not be the timeline.
Okay, thank you. That's great to know.
Yep. And then Kim asked, does the use of funds need to be specific or should be more general, for instance, to support a program that was affected? It's really up to you. It doesn't ask for, the proposal does not ask for a detailed budget breakdown. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that question, Kim? I'm not quite sure I understand.
Well, like if you were going to talk about, for instance, a program that had a specific expense that accumulated that needed to be paid off or whatever, and you were just talking about that specific thing, but actually for that program, there's a whole lot of expenses, that need to be, that could be addressed. Is it better to be specific and say, this is what the money's going to go for, is to pay for this particular part of the program, or would it be better to just say there's a whole bunch of things that went wrong and it'll go toward those, addressing those problems or needs?
I think either one's appropriate as long as you're able to say why the program is eligible. So able to say why the program addresses public health or addresses the economic impact of the pandemic or so on, and sort of make the compelling case, then, you probably want to get some sense of that sort of scale. Like if it's $1 million program and you're asking for a $10,000 grant, that's obviously a little bit of a challenge. And so I'd be probably more specific about how the money will be spent, but this is not, there's no budget. This is not a matter of we're going to send 14 cents on paper clips and $1.42 on stamps. Like this, not in great detail, just in general, this money will allow us to do X. What other questions do folks have?
So you gave an example at the beginning of what not to use this for, basically not to cap off something that you've already funded. Is there any other examples that you can think of where would not be a good fit?
Yeah, I think the main thing is that so I think what you're referring to, the previous example was if you've already been funded through the ARP, don't apply for additional funding for the same program that you got funded for. And then the other guidance was, it should be, the program should be a service provided to the community, not strictly economic support for the nonprofit or the applicant. Now, of course, you could apply to say a number of nonprofits or a number of small businesses were impacted, and here's a program we'd like to run to address the needs of nonprofits or address the needs of small businesses or so on, but not like the PPP loan where it's like, going back to the previous question about should the applicant be able to show they were negatively impacted? No, that's not what this is about. This is about providing a service to address the needs in the community related to the pandemic. Beyond that, I think there's going to be a really wide range of applications. The eligibility guidelines are like strangely narrow and strangely broad at the same time. So the first time I read them, I'm like, there's almost nothing. It's so narrow. And then it feels like, okay, but like almost everything comes down to negative public health impact or negative economic impact. So I think there will be a real range of applications for this particular program.
Jessica?
Yes.
When you mentioned if you're applying for multiple districts, and then you said something like they would be evaluated separately. Yes. I mean, that means they're evaluated
by separate people.
Yes, and then it doesn't necessarily have to be the same dollar amount of ask or anything.
Like if you're looking to serve, X number of people in one district and Y number of people in another, the dollars might be different, and that's totally fine.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, that's a great question.
And just to be super clear, those are in separate applications. So like, here's my application for this. Okay, got it.
I'm just taking notes on these questions because I'm going to be circulating in the next few days a recording of this session, as well as a sort of FAQs document and the presentation slides, so that folks have, or maybe the document or the slides, but so that you can refer back. And I'm capturing these questions and I'll answer them in the document as well.
Jessica, at the supervisors meeting, because I didn't listen, did they comment that possibly there might be more requests than funds available and how they would deal with that?
They didn't talk about that, but I would definitely expect that there'll be more requests than there is funding available. And so once this county staff does the eligibility review, they'll parcel out the relevant applications to the relevant district staff, supervisors and staff, and the supervisors and staff will review and discuss the applications. And I don't want to speak for how each supervisor will sort of design their decision-making process, but they will develop a slate of proposed grantees, so how they want to spend their $50,000. And then that will go back to the Board of Supervisors so that the whole slate of the whole 250 will be approved.
Jessica, I'd like to thank you because this has been short, informative, and kind of inspiring. So I'm taking all kinds of notes and look forward to seeing your notes. But
I'm glad to hear that.
You are excellent. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much.
I will not call you under any circumstances, however.
You can. I mean, if you're running into questions, like I'm not the person to ask on eligibility. That's really a county question. And like I said, my team's not reviewing any grants. But if you've got process questions, best practices questions, you're having trouble with the link questions, I mean, that's, I guess that's too. But feel free to reach out, and also, and in particular, feel free to come to those office hours. To the extent we can keep the questions to the office hours, that's helpful, just so that everyone's got access to the same information. But of course, if you're on the thing and you need an answer, just feel free to send me an email. Here's my email address.
Thank you really very much.
Absolutely.
Very good presentation. Superb.
And here are the links one more time.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, that's not the whole links. Give me a second.
I want to thank you as well when you opened up and you gave the explanation of what it is that your organization was going to do. It was almost like you had read my mind last night about making sure that there was some sort of liaison that was going to do outreach and was going to make sure that smaller organizations didn't fall through the cracks. And I think that that is such an important piece of making sure that this is an equitable process. And so
thank you. To that end, I was hoping to do for the info session something around like language and accessibility, language and disabilities and accessibility, and didn't pull that off yet. But if there's anyone who's running into issues with this because of language or accessibility, shoot me an email if you hear about that, and we will get it resolved. So I want to make sure that this is, particularly because part of the value of this mini grant process is that it is accessible to like small local grassroots organizations. And so we want to make sure that folks are able to access the process. So if you hear of any concerns, et cetera, please email me and we'll figure it out.
I wanted to say thank you too, Jessica. You answered all my questions, so that's the best part of
Glad to hear it.
What you were able to do. So you answered everything ahead of time. So that was perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. So I'm just going to hang out until 3 o'clock in case anyone else pops in. If you've got any further questions, feel free to stay on. If not, feel free to drop off, and I will circulate the recording and the FAQs by early next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Jessica?